Everything you think you know about Sparta is a recruitment poster. The discipline, the valor, the red cloaks, the phalanx holding the line at Thermopylae while the rest of Greece trembled. That version of Sparta has been sold to you in films, in video games, in motivational quotes posted on gym walls by people who have never read a single primary source. It is a brand, a very old, very successful brand, and like most brands, it was built by hiding the parts that do not photograph well. Here is one of the parts they hid. Every year, in the hills and valleys surrounding the city of Sparta, trained killers were deliberately released into the darkness with orders to murder. Not enemy soldiers, not criminals, not invaders crossing a border. The targets were the people who farmed Spartan land, cooked Spartan food, built Spartan walls, and outnumbered Spartan citizens by a ratio that kept every Spartan lawmaker awake at night. The targets were the helots, enslaved people, and the young men sent to kill them were not rogue elements, not criminals acting outside the law. They were the best and brightest of Spartan youth, selected precisely because they had demonstrated exceptional ability. They were acting on official orders, under state sanction, as part of a program so deliberately systematic that it had its own name. The Krypteia, the secret thing, the hidden institution, the part of Spartan education that the Spartans themselves preferred not to advertise and that modern admirers of Sparta prefer not to discuss. Tonight we are going to discuss it. We are going to go into the hills with those young men and understand exactly what they did, why the state ordered it, how it functioned as a machine of control, and what it reveals about the civilization that produced the legend. Because once you understand the Krypteia, you cannot look at Sparta the same way again. And more than that, you start to see something uncomfortable about every society that has ever built its glory on the labor of a people it simultaneously feared and despised. Before we go any further, if you find yourself drawn to the parts of history that the textbooks compress into a single paragraph, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button now. Every video here goes somewhere most historical content refuses to follow. That support keeps this work going. Now let us go back to the beginning. To understand the Krypteia, you have to understand the world that produced it. And that world rested on a foundation so unstable, so permanently threatening, that it shaped every single decision Sparta ever made. That foundation was the helot system. The helots were not slaves in the sense that most people picture when they hear the word. They were, more precisely, a conquered people held in permanent collective bondage. The two largest groups were the Messenians, conquered in a series of brutal wars in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, and the Laconians, the original inhabitants of the Eurotas Valley who had been subjugated even earlier. These people were attached to the land. They could not be sold individually. They could not be freed by a private citizen. They worked specific plots of Spartan territory and were required to hand over a fixed portion of what they produced, the rest, theoretically, their own. In practice, their lives were entirely controlled by a state that regarded them as permanent property. And there were a lot of them. Ancient sources give varying numbers, but the consensus among modern historians is that helots outnumbered Spartan citizens by somewhere between 7-1 and 15-1, depending on the period. That ratio is not a footnote. It is the central fact of Spartan civilization. Every institution Sparta built, every custom it developed, every seemingly strange decision it made about how to raise its young was shaped by the awareness that the people doing the work vastly outnumbered the people holding the whips. A Spartan citizen walking through his own territory was always, on some level, walking through enemy territory. The helots had revolted before. The First Messenian War, the Second Messenian War, decades of grinding conflict before the subjugation was finally secured. And everyone in Sparta knew, in the way that people know things they do not say out loud at dinner, that the helots had not forgotten. They were waiting. And so Sparta built its entire civilization around the question of how to keep them from ever acting on that waiting. Some of the mechanisms were economic. The fixed tribute kept helots perpetually close to subsistence, preventing the accumulation of wealth that might fund organized resistance. Some were social. Helots were required to wear specific clothing, to perform specific humiliations in public, to be beaten in rituals that had no purpose except to make degradation visible and routine. Plutarch describes the Spartans making helots drunk on unmixed wine and then displaying them in that state to young Spartan boys as a lesson in what they should never become. That ritual degradation was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a technology. It reminded helots of their status in a way that was physically enforced and publicly witnessed, and it taught young Spartans to feel contempt rather than solidarity. If you can be made to see a person as ridiculous, as less than, as a category rather than an individual, the threshold for violence against them drops considerably. Sparta understood this in the practical terms of a society that had been managing a potentially explosive population for generations. And then, underneath all of this, there was the Krypteia. The Krypteia is described by several ancient sources, but the clearest account comes from Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus. Lycurgus was the semi-mythical lawgiver credited with designing the entire Spartan system. Here is what Plutarch says. The overseers of the young men sent out from time to time those who seemed most intelligent into the country districts, equipped with daggers and basic rations, but nothing else. In the daytime they dispersed into obscure places where they hid themselves and rested. At night they came down into the roads and killed any helot whom they caught. They also frequently went into the fields and killed the most vigorous and powerful of the helots. The philosopher Aristotle was reportedly so disturbed by the practice that he called it an act of impiety, a word that carried significant moral weight in the ancient world. He connected the Krypteia specifically to a formal declaration of war that the Spartan state made against the helots every year, a ritual legal procedure that served a very specific purpose. If you formally declared war on a population before killing them, the killings were not murders. They were acts of war. The legal and religious problem of killing people who were technically under your protection was solved by declaring them your formal enemies every single year, in perpetuity, so that the killing could continue without theological complications. The invention of bureaucratic justification for atrocity is not a modern phenomenon. Sparta was doing it 2,500 years ago. Now let us look more carefully at who was being sent out and why. The Krypteia was not a punishment. It was not given to the weak students or the troublemakers. It was given to the young men who had distinguished themselves in the agog, the brutal Spartan educational system that took boys from their families at the age of 7 and turned them into soldiers over the next 13 years. The Krypteia came specifically to the ones who had done best, who had shown the most intelligence, the most physical capability, the most self-control. The Krypteia was, in the most clinical sense of the word, a graduate program. The young men selected were typically in their late teens or very early 20s. They were given a knife, minimal food, and sent out alone or in very small groups into the Laconian countryside. They lived outside, without shelter. They had to survive by taking food from the land, essentially stealing from the helot agricultural system they were simultaneously surveilling. During the day, they hid. They avoided being seen. They studied movement patterns. They identified individuals. They gathered information about who among the helot population was organizing, speaking, meeting in groups, demonstrating any quality that might translate into leadership. And at night, they came out and they killed. Plutarch is explicit about the targeting of the most vigorous and powerful. This was not random. This was systematic decapitation of potential resistance leadership. If a helot man was known to be physically strong, respected by others, capable of inspiring loyalty, he became a target. His very qualities were his death warrant. The young Spartans were being trained to identify threats before they materialized and eliminate them before they could consolidate. This is counterinsurgency doctrine developed not in a 20th century military manual, but in the agricultural valleys of ancient Greece. What did this experience do to the young men who went through it? The young men sent on the Krypteia were not monsters going in. They were products of a system that had spent 13 years shaping them. The agog had already done the foundational work of dissociation, separating the boys from normal emotional responses to pain, deprivation, and the suffering of others. The Krypteia extended that project into the specific domain of killing. A young man who spent months hiding in daylight, tracking human beings, and then killing them in the dark was being changed at a level that is difficult to articulate, but easy to recognize. He was being habituated. The first kill is always different from the 20th. The first time a person takes a human life, even in a context where they believe it is justified, something happens internally that cannot be fully described, but is universally reported. Something shifts. The Krypteia was designed to produce young men for whom that shift had already happened under controlled circumstances, before they ever faced a real military engagement. They emerged from the program desensitized in a very specific and very useful way. They could kill efficiently, quietly, without the hesitation that kills the wrong person in the chaos of battle. The Krypteia was, among other things, a program for manufacturing professional killers while dressing the process in the language of education and citizenship. But here is where the story deepens in a direction that most accounts simply do not go. The experience was not only about what it did to the young Spartan killers, it was equally about what it did to the helot population that lived beneath the shadow of it. Terror is a technology. It functions not primarily through the number of people it kills, but through the number of people it changes. A helot who knew that in any given season, a trained Spartan youth might be hiding in the hills, watching his movements, deciding whether he was too vigorous, too respected, too much of a potential leader, that helot would modify his behavior. He would avoid being seen to gather people around him. He would not speak too loudly or too openly. He would work visibly and obediently and keep his head down. And if someone in his community was known to be organizing, the social pressure to suppress that person, to report him, to distance from him, would be enormous. The Krypteia did not have to kill every potential leader. It only had to kill enough of them, consistently enough, across enough generations, to establish in the helot population a permanent awareness that leadership was dangerous, that standing out was dangerous, that being too capable was dangerous. The most successful totalitarian systems throughout history have operated by exactly this logic. You do not have to imprison everyone. You only have to make clear through selective and exemplary violence that no one is safe from being selected. Sparta maintained control over a numerically superior population for approximately 400 years. That is not an accident, that is engineering. The helots were not passive. The historical record, even filtered through hostile sources, shows a people who resisted where they could and waited where they had to. The Second Messenian War was a large-scale helot revolt that came terrifyingly close to destroying Sparta entirely. The poet Tyrtaeus, a Spartan, wrote about it in terms that conveyed genuine existential panic. This was a war that went on for years, possibly decades, and that the Spartans won only with difficulty. After the Second Messenian War, the historical consensus is that this is when the Spartan system hardened into its most extreme form. The agoge became more rigorous. The social control mechanisms became more systematic. And the Krypteia, in its fully developed form as a state-sponsored killing program, was formalized if it had not been already. The revolt proved that the fear was justified, and the Spartan response was to make the machinery of suppression more efficient, more systematic, and more deliberately brutal. During the Great Earthquake of 464 before the Common Era, which devastated Sparta and killed enormous numbers of citizens, the helots seized the opportunity and rose again. The resulting conflict lasted for years and required Athenian military assistance before it was finally suppressed. The survivors were allowed to withdraw to Naupactus under a negotiated settlement, one of the few moments in which a helot community achieved something resembling a formal agreement rather than simply being crushed. The names of helots who refused, who organized, who ran, who killed a Spartan youth in the dark of the hills before he could kill them, those names are gone. They are the most complete erasure in an already heavily edited historical record. Pausanias, the Spartan regent who commanded the Greek forces at the Battle of Plataea in 479 before the Common Era, one of the most decisive Greek victories over Persia, is said to have begun his career in the Krypteia. Whether this is accurate or retrospective embellishment is uncertain, but if true, it is instructive. The man who helped save Greek civilization at one of its most celebrated moments was formed, at least in part, by a program of systematic murder in the dark. Greek civilization, the civilization that gave the world philosophy and democracy and tragedy, rested on a foundation that included the Krypteia. The achievement and the atrocity are not separate things. They are the same thing, viewed from different angles. We prefer to look at the angle with the better lighting. It is worth pausing to address an argument that is sometimes made in defense of the Krypteia. The argument goes like this: Sparta existed in a world of constant military threat. In that context, the Krypteia was a pragmatic response to an existential security problem. This argument has a surface plausibility that deserves to be engaged rather than simply dismissed. But the pragmatic defense fails for a reason that becomes clear when you look at what the Spartan state could have done instead. The helot problem existed because Sparta had conquered the Messenians and the Laconians and chose to hold them in permanent subjugation rather than integrating them, which other Greek cities did with conquered populations. The Krypteia was not a response to an unavoidable security problem. It was a response to a security problem that Sparta had created and then maintained because the helot system was economically convenient. The subjugation of the helots freed every Spartan citizen from agricultural labor, which in turn allowed every Spartan citizen to spend his entire life training for war, which in turn created the military dominance that allowed Sparta to maintain the subjugation of the helots. It was a closed loop, and the Krypteia was the violence required to keep that loop from breaking open. Defending the Krypteia as a pragmatic necessity is like defending the slave patrols of the antebellum American South as a pragmatic response to the security problem of a large enslaved population. Technically accurate as a description of function, but blinded to the prior choice that made the function necessary. Now let us look at how the Krypteia fitted into the broader Spartan social system. The Krypteia appears to have been assigned to young men toward the end of the agoge process, typically around the age of 18 to 20, before they were formally enrolled in the full citizen army. Young men at that age are physically capable, past the period of maximum docility, beginning to assert identity, beginning to need a sense of purpose and belonging that is not simply imposed from outside. The agoge had spent years breaking them down. The Krypteia was, in part, a rebuilding. It gave them agency, the terrifying kind of agency that comes from being trusted with lethal power, from being told that the state believed in their judgment enough to send them out alone with a knife. It was also a bonding mechanism, the shared experience of having done something that could not be spoken about publicly, of having crossed a line that the rest of the world would consider monstrous if it knew the details, creates a powerful form of cohesion. Initiation through transgression binds more tightly than initiation through achievement, because achievement can be repeated by anyone, but shared transgression creates a closed group defined by mutual complicity. The young men who returned from the Krypteia did not return as individuals who had passed a test. They returned as members of a group that shared a secret and that shared an investment in the system that had made their transgression not just permissible, but honorable. They had too much to lose by questioning it. The genius of the Krypteia was that it solved three problems simultaneously. It suppressed helot resistance through selective killing. It produced battle-hardened soldiers with real experience of killing. And it created a cohort of young citizens psychologically committed to the system, not just through ideology, but through participation in its darkest mechanism. There is one dimension to the Krypteia that is almost never examined in the popular treatments of Spartan history, and that is what the young men sent out into those hills actually carried back with them. The Spartan cultural ideal demanded that emotion be buried, that the face remain still, that the voice remain level. But those emotions do not disappear simply because a culture forbids their expression. They go underground. They change shape. The young man who returned from months of nocturnal killing came back into a society that would celebrate what he had done, that would never ask him about it directly, and that would expect him to carry the experience silently for the rest of his life. The silence was not incidental. It was structural. The Krypteia existed in the space between what a society does and what a society says it does. And the young men who had gone through it were the living embodiment of that gap. They carried the knowledge of what the system actually required, underneath all the poetry about courage and loyalty and the beautiful death. And they were never permitted to put it down. The Spartan officer class, the men who commanded the armies during the period of Spartan hegemony, was almost universally drawn from men who had passed through the Agog and the Krypteia. The behaviors that historians have labeled as Spartan political brutality, the summary execution of thousands of helots described by Thucydides during the Peloponnesian War, the willingness to use extreme violence as a first rather than last resort, the apparent ease with which Spartan commanders ordered massacres that shocked even their hardened contemporaries, all of these make considerably more sense when you understand the program that produced the men ordering them. They were not making exceptions to their values when they ordered mass killings. They were applying skills and habits that their society had spent years carefully developing in the dark of the Laconian hills. How did the institution finally end? The Krypteia was not abolished through an act of enlightenment. It ended because the system it sustained collapsed. The catastrophic defeat at Leuctra in 371 before the Common Era, where the Theban general Epaminondas shattered the Spartan phalanx and killed 700 Spartiates in a single afternoon, was the beginning of the end. After Leuctra, Epaminondas marched into the Peloponnese, liberated Messenia, and helped the Helots build the city of Messene as a free Messenian state. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, the Messenian Helots were free people with a city of their own. The foundation of Sparta's entire economic and military system had been removed. Without Helot labor, there was no way to sustain the Agog. Without the Agog, there was no way to sustain the army. The Krypteia, as a functioning institution, effectively ended when the system it served was broken, not because anyone decided it was wrong, because the power that sustained it collapsed. The liberation of the Messenian Helots was not achieved through the Spartans deciding they had been wrong. It was achieved through a Theban general defeating them in open battle and making the liberation structurally irreversible by giving the freed population a fortified city and a state of their own. Institutions built on systematic violence against subjugated populations do not typically reform themselves from the inside. They require external disruption. That is what the evidence shows, again and again, across the long record of how certain kinds of injustice actually end. What does the Krypteia tell us about how we have chosen to remember Sparta? The Spartan myth was useful to the Nazis, who invoked it repeatedly in their own ideology. It was useful to militaristic nationalist movements throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, all of whom found in the image of the disciplined Spartan warrior a usable model for the kind of society they wanted to build. The convenient part of the myth translates easily across different political contexts. The inconvenient part, the systematic murder of the people who made all of that possible, is left in the fine print. The film 300 grossed nearly $500 million. It presented Spartan warriors as champions of freedom against Persian tyranny. This is historically ironic to a degree that would be comedic if it were not so complete, because the Spartan warriors fighting for Greek freedom were fighting to preserve a society built on the most systematically brutal form of mass enslavement in the ancient Greek world. The Helots had less freedom than many Persian subjects. The freedom being defended at Thermopylae was specifically the freedom of Spartan citizens, a tiny minority, maintained by the permanent unfreedom of a much larger population. The Krypteia is one of the excluded angles of that story, and it changes everything when you include it. Strip away the poetry, strip away the gleaming shield and the red cloak, and what you find underneath is the Krypteia. Young men in the dark with knives, killing the people whose labor made everything else possible, on the orders of a state that had declared them enemies so that the killing could be clean. That is Sparta, not the brand, the thing itself. History that has been cleaned up to function as inspiration is not history, it is advertising. What you have just heard is the part of the advertisement they cut before broadcast. Thank you for staying with this through to the end. Leave a comment telling me what changed and how you see Sparta after hearing this, and come back next time when we pull back another curtain that history has been careful to keep in place.